Theoretical Times, a podcast series between Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
And I'm Steve Redhead.
And welcome to our next instalment of Theoretical Times. This is exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we're going to do a couple for you on this beautiful Saturday afternoon in Bathurst. Can I say the day before the Bathurst 1000, or what's now known as Bathurst Day in Australia. But before the car race, we thought we'd do something a little bit more intellectual. But maybe not, because our first topic is Slavoj Zizek. Zizek was born in 1949, and he's easily the most famous Slovenian Marxist philosopher ever. Needless to say, it's probably a field of one. Steve, why do you think Zizek has been so influential in such a diversity of fields, including, say, media, communication, cultural studies, psychoanalysis, obviously, but also film theory and perhaps politics and political theory as well?
I think that Zizek has been able to develop a breakdown of high and low culture in a way that actually nobody else over the last 20 or 30 years has been able to do. And I think that's really stood him in good stead, because there's no doubt that he is a major high theorist, and he's marketed as that around the world. And you could say that he is one of the most famous international philosophers of his day. But he also deliberately goes into popular culture as well as high culture, and he applies high theory to popular culture. And I think he's almost cornered that field internationally. And students, particularly in these times globally, are more and more interested in the way in which really sophisticated high theory can be applied to popular culture. And it's something that used to be called postmodernism, perhaps 20 years ago, which people like myself probably did in a lazy way. But actually that's what the issue was to do with. It was a breakdown of high and low culture, high and low theory, and a kind of recombination of those things. And I think Zizek's the best example I can think of over the last 20 years of someone doing that.
And what's really important, I think, is that he never apologised for doing that either. I mean, you think about the Kung Fu Panda stuff, for example. He never apologised for it in a way that, say, with the greatest respect to the late Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was always quite uncomfortable with popular culture. He did apply high theory to it, but often he said, I think he almost did it overtly at times, I'm only interested in popular culture because it's helping me understand ideology or helping me understand politics. The actual popular culture, I would argue, perhaps wasn't of much interest to him, but you get a sense with Zizek that it really is. And that leads to my second question about what changes or what critiques do you think Zizek has offered to Marxist theorisations of ideology?
I think Zizek's connection to Marxism is really quite complicated, although he is held up as a Marxist theorist and one of the main people regenerating neo-communism for the 21st century. But actually, if you look back to his PhD thesis of 30 years ago, which has just been published in English, The Most Sublime Hysteric, subtitled Hegel with Lacan, it is actually very obviously a Hegelian piece of work. And he was criticised, funnily enough, at the time, for not being Marxist enough in this thesis. And you can read it in English now, just come out, and you can see why. But I think right from the start, actually, he was a Hegelian, and he added Lacan to that, and the published PhD thesis is a good example of that. And in many ways, it's only later that he really comes to excavate Marxist theory. He has an odd relationship to it in many ways. And I think even in terms of a politics of the left, for a long time in the 90s, for example, he was more interested in what you would say now is kind of liberal democratic politics. He was even involved in Slovenian politics. So I think it's only over a period, actually working with other theorists around the world and connecting with people like Alain Badiou, who were more established Marxists of the left. So I think what he's come to is later in his life, actually, later in his career, an excavation of Marxism. But I still think, actually, his real connection is to Hegel and to Hegelianism. And in many ways, I would question the way in which he has sort of plunged into Hegel without moving to historical materialism, which, in fact, is what Marx did. So I think, although he's branded as this leftist theorist, and I think in political terms he certainly is, his relationship to Marxism is really uncomfortable in many ways. And what he's doing is by going deeper and deeper into Hegel, his latest book, which has just come out, is called Absolute Recoil, which is actually trying to re-energise dialectical materialism, which in the 20th century got completely slammed because it was connected to Stalin and to Stalinism. But I think you've really got to be very careful in tracing his Marxism and what it has done.
That's a fascinating answer, and I certainly hadn't thought it through in that way. My response to it had always been, Steve, that because of his ambivalent relationship, nay, commitment with nationalism, it's an ambivalent nationalism, that created the complexity with Marxism. But I think your argument is much more convincing. But I always think he had that great embodiment of the Benedict Anderson imagined communities, because he almost wanted to believe in a version of nationalism in an evangelical way, but without content. But it's the Hegelianism that perhaps created the ambivalence around nationalism as well.
Yes, and I think we have to remember also, because he was part of the old Yugoslavia,
Indeed.
Slovenia was part of the old Yugoslavia, he had an experience of Stalinism like his cohorts, which was very different from people in the West.
And we have to acknowledge that. I think we have to really acknowledge that and understand that context and that personal biography. The fascinating variable in this discussion, Steve, we've already sort of mentioned the celebrity element of Zizek, but the International Journal of Zizek Studies, no, I'm not making this up, it's an open access, wonderful journal actually, refers to Zizek as, quote, the Elvis of cultural theory, end of quote. That's one of my favourite phrases. So why do you think Zizek is so popular? And more importantly, do you think he's more young Elvis or fat Las Vegas Elvis?
Yes, he is actually a writer for his own journal, the International Journal.
Isn't that a surprise?
Zizek Studies, which is a great open access journal. I'm very much in favour of all of those sorts of things. And I think it's great to see that, actually. Baudrillard, I know, was very much in support of his own International Journal of Baudrillard Studies before he died. And Zizek is still a writer for the International Journal of Zizek Studies. But I think he absolutely revels in the celebrity intellectual culture, and he's played it beautifully. I mean, he and his publishers, people like Verso in particular, have made a small fortune out of doing this, and good luck to them. And they've played that cultural globalism beautifully. But I think it's odd, really, in some ways, that he gets these epithets. I mean, he's been slagged off a lot of the time, but also he's seen as, it's interesting about the Elvis thing, he's seen as part of popular cultural theory. And I do think that's one of the things, as we've already said, that marks him out. Also, I think there is, as I say in this project, Theoretical Times, that I'm working on at the moment, this is an era. Actually, Zizek himself says that today is the time for theory.
Wow.
And I think that's a very good quote, and I've used it as part of this Theoretical Times project. I think we're in a different era. We're actually post-disciplinary in many ways. And what we're actually moving to is a whole series of systems based on particular theories. Zizek's a very good example. There's a very good new Zizek dictionary just come out, edited by Rex Butler at Queensland University. Really excellent volume, but there's lots of these sorts of things going on, so that the theories that I'm talking about in Theoretical Times actually have their own systems, their own dictionaries, their own encyclopedias built around them. So you've
They're
actually
almost like an organism.
You've got
Organic.
systems of thought organically developing, yeah. And Zizek is probably the best example of it. But I think he also plugs into this popular cultural theory and celebrity intellectual culture. But I think he actually Zizek particularly, plugs into the idea of, the live intellectual. The point about Zizek, he's alive, and with all his tics and oddities.
The weird nose thing.
And also a brilliant, there's no doubt, this guy is a brilliant speaker and a brilliant theorist and a brilliant writer.
Yeah.
And I think people generally are so sick of the banal and the dumbed down in our global culture that this is part of something which is actually very hard work. Zizek, certainly in his theoretical work, is hard to read. In his more op-ed work, he's a very good communicator. The work is a lot easier there, but still pretty cutting-edge politics. So I think he's plugged into a number of these trajectories, and that's why Zizek is actually popular.
I think that's a great answer, and also it's very interesting in terms of your and my career and relationship with scholars like this. Is you know as well as I do, Steve, in the last 10, particularly 20 years, you almost had to apologise for being a theorist. And you and I made a deal when we returned back to Australia that we would never again apologise for being theoretical or being a theoretician. And so whenever that question comes back, oh, that's theory, it's like, yes, it is. And the problem with that is, it's quite important that you claim that this is difficult, complicated, imaginative, expansive work. And I think this is a particularly important time to do that.
Yeah, and he's head-butted the opposition to that and left a space for people like us all around the world.
Yeah.
And it's opening up amazingly. It really is a new era.
It really is bodies of knowledge, I think. So what value do you think that Zizek gains from theorising, and I'll use the phrase, the postmodern subject?
Yes, I think he's a very, very interesting theorist on subjectivity and what Althusser called interpolation. He's certainly been able to develop a very interesting account of how subjects are formed, how individuals are formed, and how subject positions are formed. Because he takes from psychoanalysis, particularly Jacques Lacan. He takes from Hegel, takes some elements of Marx and people like Althusser, but he's really mashed it all together in a particularly distinctive way, a really brilliant way in some ways. But like many of these other theorists, you kind of go away from his explanations of the subject and think, is this actually satisfactory? It's formidable in many ways as an edifice, but a lot of the time I think if you start to prick it, there are real problems. But I think he has actually opened up new theories of the subject, which actually the postmodern theorists didn't really get hold of. And it is quite interesting that he started by using, in the 80s and 90s, terms like postmodern subject and postmodernism. But as that has become more criticised and perhaps less fashionable, he's still ridden the wave. So I think he certainly is still a theorist of subjectivity, and a formidable one at that.
Indeed, and as you've said, I've always thought when I read a lot of the Zizek work, it has a flight of ideas sense to it. And that's what you're saying, well, if you prick it a little bit, it maybe is a bit flighty, if you like, it may be a bit flimsy, but he does create new space. As you've said, he almost throws a rock into a pond and creates resonance for the rest of us to follow, even though you go, well, was that a good throw? Probably not, but he has created new space, I think.
Yeah, no doubt about that, in ways in which, we'll be working on for years, I think, in the global academy.
Yeah, so therefore, how would you address the charge that Zizek offers critique but doesn't actually create distinctive social or political alternatives?
I think in some ways you could have said that about Zizek in the first perhaps 10 or 15 years of his career. But I think the last 15 or 20 years of his work, and if you read it as a body of knowledge, the theoretical work and the political work and the journalistic work, it is actually creating something different. I think he's come together with people like Alain Badiou and being able to work on what they would call neo-communism, a communism for the 21st century. I think Zizek's very clear on his antithesis to Stalinism, for example, which he grew up in, but also to 20th century authoritarian communism in the first place. But that doesn't mean to say he doesn't think communism isn't a solution to capitalism. I think he does. I think he thinks that 21st century communism, or a neo-communism, is a political solution, a global solution, although a very difficult one, to the international global capitalist system. And I think he's able to say that we have, that as far as Marx is concerned, the idea that a proletariat or a traditional working class would eventually overthrow capitalism is completely gone. Yeah. That is over as far as Zizek is concerned. And what he is then able to say, and particularly in his political work, do is actually try to put together aspects of dissent all over the world through, green dissent, through feminism, through other forms of nationalist political dissent, and so on, in a very clever way. I think he does this theoretically brilliantly, but he is actually post-Marxist in that sense. But it doesn't mean to say he doesn't think there is actually a communist solution to the capitalist problem. And I think he does that now with people like Alain Badiou in such a way that this is actually a very sophisticated project. These are major theorists and major theories for our time, and I think they will have an effect. I really do think they will have are already having an effect globally and politically.
You are convincing me, and I've certainly enjoyed reading Zizek in the last 5 years or so. But what put me off Zizek originally, where I thought he was a bit of a pretender, a bit of a weirdo, was of course his obsession, and I'll say that, his obsession with Lacan. I mean, I just, when I read Lacan, when I hear the word Lacan, I switch off. It's a real problem I've got. It's perhaps my blockage. And maybe some podcast listeners share that blockage with me. But why do you think Lacan has been so important to Zizek?
You're absolutely right that Lacan is actually absolutely central to Zizek. And the PhD that we were talking about before, that was written 30 years ago, was about actually adding Lacan to Hegel, or making Hegel look a Lacanian. And I think there is a lot of strength in that work, and he's continued to do it ever since that PhD, even more strongly today in his big theoretical books. And he believes that psychoanalysis is added to political and social and cultural theory is absolutely essential. Whether you agree that Lacan is the psychoanalyst that you should be using is perhaps a different matter.
Yeah.
But he certainly does pick up Lacan as absolutely essential. And he's given a rebirth, in fact,
Indeed.
to Lacan's work. Lacan as a dead theorist in these theoretical times is almost as important as the live ones. And a lot of
a damn shame that is.
A lot of that is as a result, actually, of people like Zizek. And I think that's great, actually, excavating theory that probably people threw out babies with the bathwater before is great. It's a great formation in my view.
So you're saying I need to go back again to Lacan? Is that what you're telling me?
I'm
back
not
to the
necessarily
late 80s, early 90s? Are you joking?
I'm not necessarily saying that, but I think we did throw the baby out with the bathwater all of the time. Lacan's a great example of that. And his work is getting better treatment, better translations, and so on.
True.
Globally, he's now part of that theoretical times in a very interesting way, I think.
Yeah, and also I think I agree with you. Some of those early translations were so rushed, as so many scholars were using Lacan, and people wanted to read it in English, that I think probably some of the translations with those long, convoluted sentences were not what we should have been reading. But final question, and is about our celebrity theorist of the day. Do you think there is a danger in Zizek being so prolific in journalism and op-ed pieces in particular?
I think there's a danger in academics. Essentially, he's an academic. He has some kind of academic post at Birkbeck in London and so on. Basically, I think he's extremely good, though, at communicating ideas to the general public, if he's writing for The Guardian or on websites or web chats or whatever. He's extremely good. He really is. Yeah. He's the best of those people. And he engages in debate in a really brilliant and collegial way, which I think, is a lesson to us all, really.
Indeed.
I think his work on politics and all sorts of aspects of culture is absolutely readable. I really do think so. Really inventive, innovative. Imaginative. Absolutely, as I say, a lesson to us all. And I think that'll continue. I think he's got a new lease of life through this. There's a new book coming out later this year called Trouble in Paradise, which is mainly, a collection of work on the politics of today, if you like. And he's done this in all sorts of forms in his career, but I think he's better at it now than ever before. I think that's partly because in these theoretical times, people like this go round. They do go around literally giving live speeches, live seminars all around the world, in South America or South Korea or Australia or wherever it is. And he's actually meeting people in huge numbers, listening to his ideas, getting ideas, challenging, and he's very good at listening to challenges to his ideas, I think, much better than most of us. And I think you can see it actually in unfolding, these political ideas which are now being communicated globally. And I think that's a very important point. He uses all sorts of aspects of new media to do that, but he also goes around the world and has done for the last 10 years or so, speaking to huge audiences. That idea of the live theorist is a bit like, bands playing live, as they're now doing as they've never done before. That's what's happening in these theoretical times. And there's a lot of parallel between cultural theory like this and popular music bands and DJs playing live.
Look, it is, because we've got these live talks which are becoming bigger than ever. Then they're digitised with digital delay. Then they circulate around the world, and then they continue to travel and deliver the analogue speeches. Yeah. So it's this amazing intellectual feedback loop, and it's incredibly quick too. The speed of it is increasing. And
Zizek has played on that better than anyone else. He's theorised this, but he's also played with it brilliantly, I think, in these theoretical times.
Steve, thanks so much for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I think the way Zizek has captured his now and proliferated it through a diversity of environments, through popular culture and high culture, I think we've captured very well today. So thank you, Dylan.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast on Theoretical Times by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.